The heat in Bent Creek was a living thing. It shimmered over the baked dirt of the main street, making the distant shapes of the low hills tremble and warp. It smelled of dust, cattle, and the sour tang of sweat that clung to every man who sought refuge in the shade of the wooden awnings. Inside Virgil Dockery's saloon, the air was thick with the added aromas of stale whiskey, tobacco smoke, and frying fat. The slow drone of a horsefly was the only sound that seemed to have any energy left in it. Mary Coulter moved through the haze with a practiced quietness. She had learned in her 6 months in this town that survival was a form of invisibility. She was a ghost in a worn calico dress, refilling glasses, wiping down the scarred wooden bar, and clearing plates with an efficiency that drew no notice. She had come from the East with $2 in her pocket and a canvas suitcase that held everything she owned. Here, she was just the saloon girl, a fixture as unremarkable as the dusty liquor bottles lining the wall. No one knew that her hands, now slick with grease and soap suds, were skilled at kneading dough until it was silken, or that they had once helped the town doctor back home set a bone and even deliver a baby in the back room of the parish house. No one knew she could read and write as well as any man in town, a secret she guarded as closely as the $2 she had managed to save. Invisibility was safety. Virgil Dockery, the saloon's proprietor, believed in a different kind of survival. His was a strategy of endless accommodation. He was a small, round man whose smile was as constant as the Texas sun, a tool he used to placate, to soothe, and to bend to the will of whoever held power. And in Bent Creek, power had a name: Clayton Merrick. Merrick sat at his usual table in the corner, a throne of cheap pine from which he ruled his dusty kingdom. He was a cattle baron, but his influence ran deeper than livestock. He owned the largest ranch, the Silver Star, which meant he controlled the water rights. He controlled the sheriff, a man named Bradley who wore his badge like a gift from Merrick himself. He controlled the town council because he paid their salaries in one way or another. Merrick was not just a man. He was the town's center of gravity. His two top hands, Pike and Jackson, flanked him like a pair of loyal hounds, their faces slack and mean. Marie was pulling a fresh loaf of bread from the small cast-iron oven in the back room when the saloon doors swung open. It was not the usual entrance of a dusty cowboy or a weary traveler. This arrival cut through the room's lazy hum like a blade. The low murmur of conversation did not stop so much as it evaporated. Even the horsefly seemed to go still. A man stood silhouetted against the blinding white glare of the afternoon. As he stepped inside and the doors swung shut behind him, his features came into focus. He was Comanche. He was not dressed in the full buckskin and feathers that some of the townsfolk might have expected from the lurid tales they told. He wore durable cotton trousers, much like any ranch hand, but his shirt was soft, smoked deerskin, and his moccasins made no sound on the floorboards. His black hair was long and braided, and his face was a mask of calm composure. He moved with a quiet deliberation that was more unsettling to the room's occupants than any overt threat could have been. He walked to the bar, his eyes scanning the room once, taking in everything, before they settled on Virgil. The saloon owner's smile faltered, becoming a stiff, unnatural grimace. He wiped his hands on his apron, a nervous tic Marie had come to recognize. "What can I get for you?" Virgil started, his voice a little too loud in the sudden tomb-like silence. Before he could finish, Clayton Merrick's voice, a low rumble that carried across the room, cut him off. "Virgil!" It was just his name, but it was a command. Virgil froze, his eyes darting from the Comanche man at his bar to the cattle baron in the corner. Every man in the room was watching, waiting. They were watching to see how Virgil would uphold the unwritten law of Bent Creek: you did not serve his kind in here. Marie watched from the doorway of the back room, the warmth of the bread against her hands. She saw the fear in Virgil's eyes, the sweat beading on his bald head. She saw the smug certainty on Merrick's face, and she saw the man at the bar, who stood with a stillness that felt more powerful than all the nervous energy in the room combined. He was not asking for a fight. He was asking for a drink of water, maybe a plate of food. He was asking to be treated like a human being. Her heart pounded against her ribs. This was the moment to stay invisible, to melt back into the shadows of the storeroom and let Virgil handle it. Let him turn the man away and appease Merrick. That was the smart thing to do. The safe thing. It was the only way to survive. But then she looked at her hands, the ones that knew how to heal and create, and something inside her, a small, stubborn ember of self-respect she thought this town had extinguished, flared to life. She placed the loaf of bread, which she had seasoned with a pinch of crushed cedar, on a cutting board. She walked out from behind the bar, her steps quiet but firm on the dusty floor. She stopped in front of the Comanche man, pointedly ignoring the collective intake of breath from the rest of the room and the burning stare from Merrick's table. She gave a small, polite nod. "Our menu has 2 items," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Stew and less greasy stew." A corner of the man's mouth twitched, the barest hint of a smile. The tension in the room did not break, but it shifted, just slightly. Her small jest had introduced an unexpected note of civility into a moment primed for ugliness. "The less greasy stew," he replied, his English perfect, his voice a low baritone, and a smile, "if you have one." "The smile is free," Marie said, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a genuine one touch her own lips. She turned to get the food, her back to the room. The silence was different now. It was heavier, charged with disapproval. As she ladled the stew into a bowl, she could feel Merrick's eyes on her. She did not need to look to know the expression on his face. She placed the bowl, a spoon, and a thick slice of her cedar-scented bread on the bar. The man, who had taken a seat, nodded his thanks. As she turned to go back to her duties, a hand shot out and clamped around her wrist. It was Merrick. He had moved from his table with a predator's silence. His grip was like iron, his fingers digging into her flesh. "What do you think you are doing, girl?" he said, his voice soft, almost conversational, which made it all the more menacing. "My job, Mr. Merrick," Marie answered, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. She refused to look at him, keeping her eyes fixed on a knot in the wooden bar. "Your job is to do as you are told," he said, his grip tightening. "And the rule in this town, in my town, is we do not serve red men." He was not speaking to her, not really. He was making a proclamation to the entire room, reasserting his authority that she had so brazenly challenged. He was making an example of her. She could feel the stares of every man in the saloon. None of them moved, none of them spoke. They were all subjects in Merrick's kingdom, and the king was displeased. "He was thirsty," Marie said, her voice barely a whisper. "I do not care if he was dying," Merrick hissed, leaning closer. His breath smelled of whiskey and self-satisfaction. "You will not do it again. Do you understand me?" He squeezed her wrist one last time, a sharp, brutal pressure that made her gasp. Then he released her, shoving her arm away as if it were something unclean. He strode back to his table without a backward glance. The matter, as far as he was concerned, was settled. Marie stumbled back, cradling her wrist. She retreated to the relative safety behind the bar, her whole body trembling. She kept her head down, her hair falling forward to hide her face as she began to wash glasses that were already clean. She could feel a deep, throbbing ache starting in her wrist. Later, when she looked, she would see the dark, ugly bruises forming, a perfect imprint of his fingers. Across the room, the Comanche man ate his stew. He ate slowly, deliberately, as if he were the only person in the room. He did not look at Merrick. He did not look at Marie. When he was finished, he placed a silver coin on the bar. It was far more than the meal was worth. He stood up and walked to the door, his steps as silent as they had been when he entered. Before he pushed the doors open, he paused. He looked over at Marie, who was still hiding behind the bar. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. In his gaze, she saw no anger, no pity. She saw only a quiet, solemn acknowledgement. Then he was gone, vanished back into the blinding heat of the afternoon. The saloon slowly came back to life. Men cleared their throats. Conversation started up again, haltingly at first, then with a forced, deliberate loudness. They were trying to pretend that nothing had happened. But something had. A line had been drawn in the dust of the saloon floor. Marie Coulter, the invisible girl, had chosen a side. And as she stared at the silver coin gleaming on the scarred wood of the bar, she had a terrible, sinking feeling that she was about to learn the price of a bowl of stew and a slice of bread. The 3 days that followed were a lesson in the physics of silence. It was a dense, heavy thing that pressed in on Marie from all sides. The usual boisterous noise of the saloon was muted. The laughter of the cowboys and ranch hands strained and brief. Men who had once offered a friendly nod or a harmless jest now studied the bottom of their glasses or the tips of their boots whenever she drew near. They were afraid, and their fear was contagious. It clung to the air like dust, settling on everything. Virgil Dockery was a man drowning in that fear. He followed Marie with his eyes, his expression a mixture of pity and frantic pleading. He would find her in the back room, where she sought refuge in the familiar comfort of her work, the rhythmic push and pull of kneading dough for the next day's bread. He wrung his hands, a constant, nervous motion. "Marie, you are a good girl, a hard worker, but you do not understand this place. You cannot win a fight against a man like Clayton Merrick." "I did not start a fight." "Virgil," she would reply, her voice low as she folded the dough over on itself. "I served a paying customer." "He is not a customer, he is a statement," Virgil insisted, his voice a desperate whisper. "Merrick made his rules clear. To defy him is to defy the whole town. Just let it be. Keep your head down. Survive. That is all any of us are trying to do." Her hands, deft and sure, worked the dough. They were strong hands, capable hands. They knew the precise moment when flour and water and yeast transformed into something life-giving. She could not explain to Virgil that keeping her head down felt like a different kind of death. She had been invisible for so long, and for one brief moment, she had chosen not to be. Reclaiming that invisibility now felt like a surrender she was not willing to make. The bruises on her wrist, faded now to a sickly yellow-green, were a constant reminder of the cost of that choice, but also of the choice itself. On the 3rd day, a little past noon, Marie was wiping down a table when she saw a man step into the general store across the street. It was Ben Tucker, the store's owner. He was a quiet, lanky man with a kind face weathered by the sun and worry. A few minutes later, he came into the saloon, a rare visit for him during the day. He did not go to the bar, but walked directly to her table. He put a small paper sack down. "Just brought in some spices from San Antonio. Thought you might like some for your baking. Your bread has been the only decent thing to eat in this town for 6 months." "Thank you, Ben. That is very kind." He looked around the quiet room, his eyes lingering for a moment on Merrick's table, where Pike and Jackson were playing a lazy game of cards. Merrick himself was not there, which offered the room a small, temporary reprieve. He leaned in a little closer, his voice barely audible. "You did a good thing the other day. Marie, a brave thing. Do not let them make you think otherwise." He paused, then added, "That Comanche fellow, his name is Tavo. He does not forget a kindness, and he does not forget an insult." Ben squeezed her shoulder gently, then turned and left as quietly as he had come. Marie clutched the small bag of spices. It was a small gesture, a whisper of support in a chorus of condemnation, but it felt like a lifeline. It reminded her that she was not entirely alone. An hour later, the saloon door swung open. "It was him, Tavo." The fragile peace of the afternoon shattered. The card game at Merrick's table stopped. Pike and Jackson looked up, their eyes narrowing. Every man in the room went still. Virgil, who was polishing the bar, looked as if he might faint. His eyes locked with Marie's, wide with terror. His expression screamed at her, "Do not! Please, do not!" Tavo walked to the bar, just as he had before. He moved with that same unnerving calm, as if he were oblivious to the waves of hostility rolling off the other patrons. He stood before Virgil, waiting. Virgil licked his dry lips. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked past Tavo, toward the corner table, as if Merrick himself were sitting there, watching. Pike shoved his chair back and stood up. He was a big, brutish man with a cruel mouth. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. I thought we told you your kind is not welcome here." Jackson laughed, a high, unpleasant sound. "Maybe he is deaf or just stupid." Tavo did not turn. He did not acknowledge them in any way. His focus remained on the terrified man behind the bar. Marie's heart hammered against her ribs. She could feel the collective will of the room pushing her down, telling her to stay put, to let Virgil refuse him, to let Pike and Jackson have their ugly sport and be done with it. It would be so easy. She looked at her hands. She thought of Ben Tucker's quiet words of encouragement. She thought of the man standing at the bar, who had asked for nothing more than a meal, and had treated her with a respect she rarely received from the other men in this town. She took a deep breath and walked out from behind her table. She moved past Pike and Jackson, ignoring their sneers. She stepped behind the bar, picked up a clean bowl, and ladled it full of the less greasy stew. Her movements were precise, economical, her hands steady. She was not a ghost now. She was a woman doing her job. She placed the bowl on the bar in front of Tavo. Virgil let out a small, choked sound, like a dying animal. "I sell food, Virgil," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "I do not sell my soul." Pike took a step forward. "Why?" "You little." "He thinks he is too good for us, but he is happy to eat with the likes of him." "Maybe she likes him," Jackson snickered. "Maybe she is tired of white men." The words were meant to sting, to shame her, to reduce her act of principle to something sordid. Marie flinched but did not turn. She sliced a piece of her fresh bread and placed it beside the bowl. Tavo began to eat, as calmly as if he were dining in the finest restaurant in St. Louis. His complete indifference to their taunts was more infuriating to them than any angry retort could have been. They were flies buzzing around a granite boulder. When he was finished, he looked at Marie. He placed another silver coin on the counter, but this time, he pushed it toward the loaf of bread. "For the baker," he said, his voice low and clear. It was a small distinction, but it was everything. He was not just paying for a meal, he was acknowledging her skill, her personhood. It was a gesture of profound respect, a quiet alliance forged over a bowl of stew. He stood, turned, and walked out of the saloon. The moment the doors swung shut, the dam of Merrick's influence broke. Virgil, finally finding his voice, scurried over to Marie. "What have you done?" he lamented, his face pale. "What have you done? He is going to ruin me. He's going to ruin us all." Before Marie could answer, Clayton Merrick himself walked in. He must have seen Tavo leaving. He took in the scene with one sweeping glance, the stunned silence of his men, Virgil's panicked face, and Marie standing her ground behind the bar. His face was a cold, controlled mask of fury. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He walked straight to Virgil, ignoring Marie completely. He put one hand on the bar, leaning in close to the trembling saloon owner. "The next time that man comes into your establishment, Virgil, you will tell him to leave," Merrick said, his voice a deadly whisper. "If he does not leave, you will get the sheriff. And if you serve him so much as a glass of water, I will personally see to it that this saloon is torn down, board by board. And the girl." He finally flickered his eyes toward Marie, a look of pure contempt. You will make sure she understands the new rules." Merrick straightened up, his authority restored. He gave a curt nod to Pike and Jackson, and the three of them walked out, leaving a thick, suffocating silence in their wake. The storm had not yet broken, but the air was electric with its coming. Marie looked down at her hands, resting on the wooden bar, the hands that had just earned a man's respect. They felt steady and strong, but for the first time, she wondered how much longer she would have them. The day after Merrick's ultimatum was a long, slow exhale of dread. The saloon was unnaturally quiet, the air thick with unspoken words and the cloying smell of fear. Every time the batwing doors creaked open, heads would turn, and a collective breath would be held until the newcomer was identified as someone other than Clayton Merrick or his men. Virgil was a ghost of himself, pale and trembling, his usual placating smile gone, replaced by a mask of raw panic. He watched Marie with the eyes of a man watching a lit fuse burn down, pleading with her through his silence to do nothing, to be nothing, to simply disappear. Marie worked with a quiet, deliberate focus, her hands finding solace in the familiar tasks of wiping glasses and scrubbing the bar. She had made her choice, and a strange calm had settled over her. It was not the calm of peace, but the calm that comes when one has accepted the inevitability of a storm. She knew Merrick would come. It was not a question of if, but when. The entire town was waiting with her. It happened in the late afternoon, when the sun slanted through the dusty windows, illuminating the motes of dust dancing in the air. The doors did not creak open. They were thrown open, slamming against the inside walls with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. Clayton Merrick stood there, but he was not alone. Behind him were Pike and Jackson, and 4 more hard-faced men from his ranch. 6 of them, a small army brought to bear against one saloon girl. They fanned out as they entered, their presence sucking all the air and light from the room. The half-dozen patrons who had been nursing their drinks froze in place. Merrick's eyes swept the room and landed on Virgil, who was trying to shrink behind his own bar. Merrick walked toward him, his boots thudding on the wooden floor, each step a hammer blow against the silence. He stopped in front of Virgil. His voice, when he spoke, was deceptively soft. "I believe I gave you an order, Virgil." Virgil nodded, unable to speak, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "And yet," Merrick continued, his gaze flicking toward Marie for a split second, "I hear you allowed my order to be disobeyed yesterday. My rules were broken. In my town." Virgil finally found his voice. A pathetic squeak. It was the girl. "Merrick, I told her not to. I told her." Merrick smiled, a chilling, humorless expression. He raised his hand, and for a moment, it seemed as if he might be offering a comforting gesture. Instead, he slapped Virgil across the face with the back of his hand. The sound was sharp, ugly. Virgil stumbled backward, crashing into the shelves of liquor bottles before sliding to the floor in a heap, a thin trickle of blood running from the corner of his mouth. No one moved to help him. Merrick had made his point. Virgil was nothing. The owner of this establishment was nothing. Only Merrick's rules mattered. Now, he turned his full attention to Marie. She stood by a table, a damp rag in her hand, her back straight, her chin held high. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her cower. He walked slowly toward her, circling the table like a wolf. He picked up an empty whiskey bottle, weighing it in his hand. "You are new here, girl," he said, his voice a low drawl that still carried to every corner of the room. "You do not seem to understand how things work. There is an order to things, a way things are done. When you disrupt that order, there are consequences. A lesson must be taught, so that everyone understands the importance of the rules." He was in front of her now, his shadow falling over her. She could smell the whiskey on his breath, the scent of leather and dust and power. He reached out and grabbed her left arm. She tried to pull back, but his grip was unyielding. He forced her hand down onto the flat surface of the wooden table, palm up. He raised the bottle. Marie cried out, a sound that was half protest, half plea. The men in the room just watched, their faces impassive masks of fear. They were all complicit in their stillness. He brought the heavy glass bottle down hard on the back of her hand. The sound was sickening, a wet, crunching noise that echoed in the dead silence. A wave of white-hot agony shot up her arm, so intense it stole her breath. She stared at her hand, at the unnatural angle of her fingers, at the way the skin was already beginning to swell and darken. It did not seem like her hand anymore. It was a broken, ruined thing. He was not finished. He released her left arm and grabbed her right. She fought him then, a desperate, wild struggle. But he was too strong. Pike and Jackson stepped forward, each grabbing one of her shoulders, holding her fast. Merrick forced her right hand onto the table next to its broken mate. "This hand," he said, his voice flat and cold, "is for the bread, a lesson for the baker." He raised the bottle again. He brought it down. Another sickening crunch, another explosion of pain that ripped a scream from her throat. He released her, and she collapsed to the floor, cradling her shattered hands to her chest, a series of ragged, pain-filled sobs tearing through her. Her world had shrunk to a universe of pure agony. Merrick tossed the whiskey bottle onto the table, where it rolled and came to a stop. He looked down at her, his face showing no emotion at all. He had not been angry. This was not an act of passion. It was a calculated act of terror, a demonstration of power for the entire town to witness. "Now everyone understands the rules," he said calmly. He turned and walked out of the saloon, his men following him like shadows. For a long moment after they left, the room remained frozen. The patrons were statues. Virgil was still on the floor behind the bar. Then the spell broke. The doors to the general store across the street flew open, and Ben Tucker rushed in. In his hands, he held an old, long-barreled pistol, something that looked like it belonged to his grandfather. His face was pale, with a mixture of fear and rage. He raised the gun, his hands trembling so badly he could barely aim it at the empty doorway where Merrick had just stood. It was a futile, heartbreaking gesture. He was too late. The courage had come, but it had come a moment too late. He looked at Marie on the floor, and the fight seemed to drain out of him. He lowered the heavy pistol, a look of profound shame on his face. The silence was broken by the sound of a woman's voice, firm and clear. "Get out of the way. Ben, let us through." Beatrice, the blacksmith's wife, a sturdy woman with kind eyes, pushed past him, followed by a younger woman named Ruth. They knelt beside Marie, their faces etched with horror and pity. The town's physician, Dr. Wilson, came in right behind them, his black bag in his hand. He knelt and gently, so gently, tried to look at Marie's hands. She flinched away, crying out in pain. "Easy now. Marie, easy," the doctor said, his voice calm and reassuring despite the grim set of his jaw. "Let me see." He examined the damage, his touch as light as a feather. He did not have to say much. The sight of her hands, twisted and swollen and horribly broken, said it all. "The bones are shattered," he said quietly to Beatrice. "Both of them. We need to get her to my office. We need to set them, what is left to set." Beatrice and Ruth helped Marie to her feet, supporting her as she swayed, lost in a fog of pain. Through her tears, she looked at her hands, the hands that had been her only real possession in the world. They were her skill, her trade, her independence. They had been her path to a new life, a way to earn her own keep, to be beholden to no one. She saw her future in that moment, and it was as broken and useless as her fingers. A wave of regret, as sharp as the pain, washed over her. Her words came out in a choked whisper. "If only I had apologized. If I had just said I was sorry." Beatrice, who was holding her steady, looked her straight in the eye. Her own eyes were wet, but her voice was as strong as the iron her husband forged. "Do not you dare say that," she said fiercely. "Sorry for what?" "For showing a man a moment of decency. Do not let that animal take your dignity from you. Marie, do not let him have that, too." They helped her toward the door. A small procession of kindness in a room full of shame. The men who had watched, who had done nothing, could not meet her eyes. They stared at the floor, at the walls, at anything but the ruin that had been made of her in their presence. Marie leaned heavily on the two women, each step sending a fresh jolt of agony up her arms. But it was the hollow ache in her soul that hurt the most. The whiskey bottle, an instrument of commerce and cheer, lay on the table, a symbol of the power that had been used to destroy her. The world had become a thick gray fog of pain. Dr. Wilson had given Marie a dose of laudanum, and it swirled through her mind, dulling the sharpest edges of the agony but replacing it with a heavy, disorienting numbness. She was in a small room above the general store, a space Ben Tucker and his wife had offered without a moment's hesitation. Beatrice had helped her into a nightgown and eased her into the narrow bed, her bandaged hands resting like two useless, monstrous lumps of white cloth on the quilt. Time had lost its meaning. There was only the rhythmic, throbbing pulse in her hands and the slow drift of consciousness. She floated in a dark sea, surfacing occasionally into moments of terrible clarity where the full weight of what had happened crashed down on her. Her hands, her future, gone. In those moments, Beatrice's fierce words were the only thing she could cling to. "Do not let him have your dignity." She was drifting in that gray space between waking and sleeping when a change in the room brought her to the surface. It was not a sound. It was a stillness, a focused presence that had not been there before. She opened her heavy eyelids. Lamplight cast a soft, flickering glow, and sitting in a straight-backed wooden chair beside her bed was Tavo. He had entered as silently as a shadow. He was not looking at her, but at her bandaged hands. His face, illuminated by the warm light, was carved from stone. His expression unreadable but for the tightness around his jaw. He seemed to be absorbing the sight of them, committing the brutal evidence of Merrick's work to memory. Marie did not feel fear. In the fog of her pain, there was no room for it. There was only a deep, hollow ache that went far beyond the shattered bones in her hands. She thought of his quiet dignity, of the respectful way he had spoken to her. She thought of the silver coins he had left, one for the meal, one for the baker. Small kindnesses that had cost her everything. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Her voice, when she spoke, was a dry, rasping whisper, the sound of broken things. "They broke my hands for serving you." It was not an accusation. It was a simple, desolate statement of fact, the final sentence in a chapter of her life that had just been violently torn out. Tavo slowly raised his head, and his dark eyes met hers. The stillness in his face was gone, replaced by an intensity that was more frightening than any shout of rage. The look in his eyes was ancient and cold and absolute. His voice, when he replied, was low and sharp, each word a perfectly honed blade being drawn from its sheath. "I will make them wish they had never touched you." The words hung in the quiet room, a promise so cold and certain it seemed to freeze the air. It was not a boast. It was a vow, a pronouncement of a future that was as inevitable as the sunrise. A shudder went through Marie, a tremor that had nothing to do with the pain. He saw the fear that flickered in her eyes, the fear of what his words implied. He leaned forward slightly, his expression softening just a fraction. "Not tonight," he said, his voice losing its sharp edge, becoming a quiet reassurance. "Justice is not a thing that hides in the dark. It must be done in the light, for all to see. I do not kill unless I am forced to kill." He reached for the tin cup of water on the nightstand. "Your lips are dry." She tried to shake her head, the effort sending a jolt through her body. "I cannot," she whispered, the simple helplessness of her situation washing over her again. He understood. He stood, and using his own clean handkerchief, he dipped a corner into the water. He knelt by the bed, his movements fluid and graceful. He gently brought the damp cloth to her lips. The water was cool, a small blessing. He did it again and again, until her thirst was slaked. His touch was impersonal, respectful, yet it was the most intimate gesture she had ever known, a profound and simple act of care. He sat back down in the chair. He looked at her, and his eyes held a deep, shared understanding of pain. Accepting help is not a weakness, Marie. It is a part of survival. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sound, the soft hiss of the lamp. The shared quiet was not empty. It was a space where two solitary people were, for the first time, not entirely alone. He was a Comanche warrior. She was a saloon girl from the East. They should have been worlds apart, but in that small, lamplit room, bound by an act of violence, they found a strange and unexpected common ground. "My father," Tavo said, his gaze distant, as if he were watching a scene from long ago, "was a great man. He knew horses better than any man I have ever met. He could see the spirit in them. One winter, a group of ranchers ran off a herd of our best mares. They rebranded them, claimed them as their own. My father rode to their camp. He did not take a weapon. He went to talk, to ask for what was ours." He paused, the muscle in his jaw tightening again. "They said he was a thief. They said he was trying to steal their horses. They shot him where he stood, for trying to take back what belonged to us." Marie closed her eyes, imagining the scene. The injustice of it was a bitter taste in her mouth. It was the same story, just with different actors. A powerful man deciding what the truth was and enforcing it with violence. "I hate this," she whispered, the words coming out with a sudden, surprising force. "I hate the fighting, the cruelty. Back home, I worked for the parish. I helped our town's doctor. I learned how to set bones, how to stitch a wound, how to help bring a new life into the world. My hands knew how to heal things." She looked down at the white bundles at her sides. "And now look at them." He looked at them too. "They are not ruined," he said with a quiet certainty. "They are a testament. They are the reason justice must be done. You stood for what was right when no one else would. That is a strength that Merrick, with all his men and all his money, can never understand. He broke your bones, but he did not break your spirit." His words were a balm on a wound she did not even know she had. Someone saw her. Someone understood the choice she had made, not just the consequence. She had been so focused on what she had lost that she had forgotten what she had not surrendered. The lamplight flickered, casting their shadows long against the wall. Outside, Bent Creek was asleep, wrapped in a blanket of ignorance and fear. But inside that small room, a fragile hope had been kindled. It was a dangerous hope, one forged in pain and sealed with a promise of retribution. Her hands, once her tools of labor and independence, had become something else entirely. They were a symbol, a debt to be paid. As Tavo sat watching over her in the quiet darkness, Marie finally drifted into a true sleep, and for the first time since the bottle had fallen, she did not dream of the pain. She dreamed of the dawn. The sun reached its zenith, a merciless white eye hanging in a bleached blue sky. At high noon in Bent Creek, the heat was an anvil, and the town was laid out upon it. The dust on the main street was as fine as flour and did not stir. It was a silence different from the days before. It was not the quiet of fear, but of anticipation. Word had traveled on whispers, carried from the general store to the blacksmith's forge, from the saloon to the small church at the edge of town. Something was going to happen. And so, the people of Bent Creek became witnesses. They emerged from their shops and homes not as a mob, but as a scattered, silent congregation. Ben Tucker stood on the boardwalk in front of his store, his arms crossed, his face grim. Virgil Dockery peeked through a crack in his saloon doors, his face slick with sweat. Beatrice stood beside her husband's forge, her hands fisted in her apron. and in the small room above the store. Marie was helped to the window by Ben's wife. She looked down at the street, her heavily bandaged hands resting on the sill. They throbbed with a dull, constant ache, a physical reminder of the cost of all this. They were all watching the man who stood alone in the center of the street. Tavo. He stood before the painted sign of the Silver Star Ranch office, the seat of Clayton Merrick's power. He was perfectly still, a solitary, unmovable figure against the shimmering backdrop of the heat. He was not waiting for a fight. He was waiting for justice. The door to the ranch office opened. Clayton Merrick stepped out, blinking in the sudden, harsh light. He was flanked by Pike and Jackson, and the other 4 men who had been with him in the saloon. They were armed, their holsters worn and ready. Merrick saw Tavo, and a slow, arrogant smile spread across his face. He saw one man, an obstacle to be removed. He did not see the dozen pairs of eyes watching him from the shadows of the awnings. Merrick and his men stepped down into the street, the dust puffing up around their boots. They walked until they were 20 paces from Tavo. "I am surprised to see you," Merrick said, his voice carrying in the stillness. "I thought your kind was better at running than at standing." Tavo did not react to the insult. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but every person on that street heard every word clearly. "I am not here for myself," he said. "I am here for the woman you harmed." Merrick laughed, a short, ugly bark. The girl. She got what she deserved. She was taught a lesson. She was taught nothing. Tavo replied, his voice as flat and hard as the land around them. "But you will learn something today. You will apologize to Marie Coulter, here, in front of these people. And you will give her enough money to leave this place, to find a doctor who can fix what you broke, and to start a new life." The sheer audacity of the demand stunned the crowd. Merrick's smile vanished, replaced by a dark flush of rage. He looked around at the faces of the townspeople, seeing for the first time that he was on a stage. "You are in no position to demand anything," he snarled. "This is my town. My rules." "Your rules are broken," Tavo said. Merrick's face contorted. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod to his men. "Kill him!" It happened in the space between one heartbeat and the next, before Merrick's words had finished echoing, before his men could fully process the command. Tavo's hand moved. It was not a draw. It was a flicker, a blur of motion too fast for the eye to truly follow. There were 4 sounds, so close together they sounded like a single, rolling crack of thunder. The first man on the left, who was just beginning to pull his pistol, screamed as his own gun was kicked from his grasp, his wrist shattering. The second man grunted and collapsed, a dark stain spreading on his thigh as his leg gave out from under him. Pike, his face a mask of disbelief, was spun around as a bullet tore through the meaty part of his shoulder, his gun arm going limp and useless. Jackson, the last to react, saw his pistol fly from his hand, a splinter of wood exploding from the grip as Tavo's 4th shot found its mark. 4 men were on the ground or clutching their wounds, their weapons scattered in the dust. Not one of them was dead. It was not a gunfight. It was a surgical procedure, a masterful and absolute dismantling of Merrick's authority. The town was held in a moment of shocked, breathless silence. Merrick stared at his men, then back at Tavo, his mind unable to comprehend the speed, the precision, the sheer impossibility of what had just happened. His power, built on the fear these men inspired, had evaporated in less than 4 seconds. Rage and desperation warred on his face. He was exposed, humiliated. In that moment, he forgot he was a cattle baron, a king in his own dusty domain. He was just a man who had lost control. His hand darted down to the fancy, silver-plated pistol at his own hip. It was an act of pure, murderous instinct. He pulled the gun, leveling it at Tavo's chest. A 5th shot rang out. It did not come from Tavo. It came from the boardwalk. Merrick's silver pistol flew from his hand, spinning through the air before clattering into the dust. He cried out, clutching his hand, which was numb and stinging, but unbroken. He stared in disbelief at the source of the shot. Standing in front of his office, a small, dark pistol held steady in his hand, was Dr. Wilson, the healer. The man who mended bones and fought fevers had just prevented a murder with a single, perfectly aimed bullet. It was the shot that broke the spine of fear in Bent Creek. The spell of Merrick's power was shattered. The crowd stirred, murmurs turning into a low growl of anger and liberation. They looked at Merrick, not with fear, but with the cold contempt they had hidden for so long. Sheriff Bradley, who had been watching from the end of the street, finally moved. He walked forward, his steps slow and deliberate. He was no longer a man owned by another. He walked past the wounded men, past Tavo, and stopped in front of a stunned Clayton Merrick. The sheriff did not say a word. He simply pulled out a pair of iron handcuffs. The metallic click as they locked around Merrick's wrists was the loudest sound Bent Creek had heard in years. Tavo walked over to the defeated man. He looked down at Merrick, whose face was a ruin of shock and disbelief. "I chose mercy," Tavo said, his voice quiet. "You have time to think about it now." He turned his back on Merrick, leaving him to the sheriff and the judgment of the town he had once ruled. The tension in the street finally broke. Someone clapped, then another. Soon, a ragged, hesitant cheer went up from the small crowd. Tavo walked to the general store and up the outer stairs. A moment later, he emerged, helping Marie. She moved slowly, her bandaged hands held carefully in front of her. Ben Tucker and Beatrice were there, their faces filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Tavo led his horse over, with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the deadly skill he had just displayed. He lifted Marie and set her in the saddle. In front of him, he swung up behind her, his arms a protective cage around her. They rode slowly down the main street. They passed the saloon, where Virgil now stood openly in the doorway, his face streaked with tears. They passed the sheriff's office, where Bradley was leading a cuffed and humbled Clayton Merrick inside. They passed the faces of the people, who watched them with awe and gratitude. It was a victory, but a bittersweet one. They were not staying to rebuild. They were leaving. The cheers were for them, but also for the town itself, for a freedom bought with a woman's pain and a stranger's courage. As Tavo and Marie rode out of town, two small figures against the vast, shimmering expanse of the prairie, they did not look back. They rode toward the horizon, leaving Bent Creek to learn how to live with its new and fragile conscience. The world beyond Bent Creek was vast and silent. The town, with its stifling heat and coiled fear, shrank behind them until it was just a collection of insignificant wooden blocks on the horizon. And then nothing at all. There was only the immense, pale sky and the endless sea of prairie grass, swaying in a wind that carried the scent of dust and wild herbs. Marie rode in front of Tavo, her back resting against his chest. The rhythm of the horse's gait was a slow, rocking motion that should have been soothing, but every jolt sent a dull, throbbing echo up her arms from her ruined hands. They were a constant, leaden weight in her lap, a testament to the violence she had left behind. For the first few hours, neither of them spoke. The silence was not empty. It was a space for the echoes of the gunshots and the cheers to fade, for the adrenaline to seep away, leaving behind a profound weariness. Tavo was a steady, solid presence behind her, his arms a secure boundary against the world. He rode with an easy confidence, his body moving in perfect sync with the horse, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, reading the subtle language of the land. As the sun began its long descent, painting the western sky in strokes of orange and purple, Tavo guided the horse into a small hollow sheltered by a cluster of gnarled mesquite trees. He slid from the horse's back and then, with an effortless strength, lifted Marie down. Her legs were stiff and unsteady, and she leaned against him for a moment, the world tilting slightly. He did not rush her. He waited until her balance returned, then helped her to a relatively smooth patch of ground. She sank down, exhausted, watching as he went about the tasks of making camp. He moved with a quiet efficiency that was mesmerizing to watch. He unsaddled the horse, tethered it where it could graze, and gathered dry wood for a fire. Each action was deliberate, purposeful, with no wasted motion. He was as much a part of this landscape as the trees and the stones. When a small, smokeless fire was crackling, he took a small pot from his saddlebag and filled it with water from a canteen. He set it near the flames to warm. Marie watched him, a lump forming in her throat. The simple, domestic act of heating water felt like a miracle after the brutality she had endured. He came over and knelt in front of her. "It is time to clean your hands." She flinched, instinctively trying to hide them. The bandages, once white, were now grimy and stained. The thought of unwrapping them, of seeing the damage again, made her stomach clench. "It must be done," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Infection is a patient enemy." She nodded, a small, jerky motion. She held out her arms, a gesture of complete trust and surrender. His fingers were surprisingly delicate as he worked at the knots Dr. Wilson had tied. He unwrapped the cloth slowly, layer by layer. The cool evening air touched her skin, and then her hands were exposed in the flickering firelight. They were a swollen, discolored mess. The skin stretched tight over the shattered bones beneath. They were ugly, pitiful things. She could not bear to look at them. Tavo's face registered no disgust, no pity. He simply studied them for a moment with a focused, clinical intensity. He dipped a clean strip of linen into the warm water and began to wash them. His touch was incredibly light, moving between the swollen fingers, cleaning away the grime and the dried blood with a painstaking patience. The warmth of the water was a profound relief, easing some of the deep, relentless ache. When he was finished, he carefully dried them and applied a thin layer of a clean-smelling salve from a small tin. He rewrapped them in fresh bandages that Beatrice must have given him, his work as neat and secure as any doctor's. As he tied the final knot on her right hand, he paused, his fingers lightly tracing the crooked shape of her knuckles beneath the cloth. "With fingers that heal this crooked," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I think your days of carrying trays are over." He met her gaze, and a rare, faint smile touched his lips. "From now on, you will only point and give orders." His words, meant to be light, struck a deep chord within her. He was not just seeing her injury. He was seeing a future for her beyond it, a future where she was not a victim, but a commander. A tear she had not known she was holding back slipped down her cheek. She did not bother to wipe it away. They ate a simple meal of dried meat and hard biscuits, and as darkness settled completely, wrapping them in a blanket of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, a new kind of peace settled over Marie. The pain was still there, a loyal and constant companion, but it was no longer the only thing she could feel. The second day, the landscape began to change. The flat prairie gave way to rolling hills dotted with groves of sturdy live oak. Marie felt stronger, less like a fragile piece of cargo and more like a fellow traveler. She found herself talking, her voice rusty at first, telling him about her life in the East, the quiet, orderly world she had left behind. He listened without interruption, his silence an invitation to continue. They stopped to rest their horse in the shade of a large oak tree. Marie slid to the ground and looked at Tavo as he checked the horse's hooves. "The men I knew back east," she said, her voice thoughtful. "They would boast about the books they had read or the money their fathers had. It was all about what they knew or what they owned." Tavo finished his inspection and came to sit in the shade near her. "And what do I boast of?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. She smiled. "You boast by shooting guns from other men's hands without saying a word." His expression was serious. "It is a different kind of knowledge. The land tells you where to find water. A man's eyes tell you when he is about to draw his gun. You learn to read what is real." He looked at her, his dark eyes seeming to see right through to her core. "And you?" Marie Coulter, You boast with a courage that makes armed men look like children." Her breath caught in her throat. No one had ever called her courageous. She had always thought of herself as a survivor, someone who got by through being quiet and useful. To be seen this way, by this man, felt more meaningful than any compliment she had ever received. That night, they camped by a small, clear stream that gurgled over smooth stones. The sound of the water was a gentle music in the vast stillness of the night. After Tavo had once again tended to her hands, they sat by the fire, watching the flames dance. The air between them was charged with a new awareness, a connection that had been forged in violence and tempered by shared solitude and mutual respect. He had been telling her a story about the stars, the names his people had for the constellations. When he fell silent, he was looking at her, and his expression was no longer just one of care or respect. There was something deeper there, a question in his eyes. He did not move, did not speak. He simply waited. In that quiet, moonlit moment, Marie understood that the world had been stripped down to its essentials. There were no rules here but the ones they made, no witnesses but the silent stars. She held his gaze and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He leaned toward her slowly. His hand came up, not to touch her face, but to gently cup the back of her head. His fingers careful not to tangle in her hair. His kiss was not what she would have expected. It was not a kiss of passion or demand, but one of startling tenderness. It was a question, a discovery, a moment of profound and quiet communion. It spoke of shared pain and the possibility of healing. It was the taste of cool water after a long thirst. When he drew back, he searched her face, his eyes asking if he had presumed too much. She gave him a small, watery smile. It was a confirmation, an answer. They did not speak of it. They did not need to. The kiss had been a conversation all its own. On the third day, a palpable sense of purpose hummed in the air. They were no longer just fleeing from something. They were riding towards something. Their silence was comfortable now, easy. Marie found herself leaning back against him not just for support, but for the simple comfort of his presence. Late in the afternoon, Tavo reined in the horse on the crest of a low hill. He pointed ahead. "Look." Below them, nestled in a wide, protected valley, was a scattering of teepees. Thin plumes of smoke rose from their centers, promising warmth and community. Horses grazed peacefully on the valley floor. It was not a fortress, but it felt like the safest place in the world. It felt like a sanctuary. They had arrived. Marie looked at the peaceful scene below, then at the strong, silent man who had brought her here. She had left Bent Creek with nothing but the clothes on her back and 2 broken hands. She was arriving here with something she had never expected to find, a flicker of hope, and the quiet, certain knowledge that she was no longer alone. As they descended into the valley, the world transformed. The stark, lonely beauty of the open prairie gave way to a landscape teeming with life. The scent of sage and wood smoke replaced the smell of dust, a comforting, domestic aroma that spoke of hearth and home. Children's laughter, a sound Marie had not heard in what felt like a lifetime, echoed between the painted hides of the teepees. Horses, sleek and well cared for, lifted their heads from their grazing to watch their approach. This was not just a camp. It was a community, a living, breathing entity nestled in the protective arms of the land. An older woman emerged from the largest teepee at the center of the camp. As Tavo reined in his horse, she was tall and slender, her posture as straight and unyielding as a young pine. Her long, dark hair was streaked with silver and braided with otter fur. Her face was a beautiful, intricate map of a life lived without compromise, her dark eyes holding a formidable intelligence and a deep, bottomless calm. This, Marie knew without being told, was Nadua, Tavo's mother. Tavo slid from the horse and spoke to his mother in the soft, flowing cadences of their language. He gestured toward Marie, his words sounding like an explanation, a story. Nadua's gaze fell upon Marie, and it was not a welcoming one. It was the sharp, assessing look of a leader evaluating a potential threat. the wary stare of a mother seeing the trouble her son had brought to their doorstep. Her eyes lingered on Marie's pale skin, her foreign dress, and finally, on the two clumsy, bandaged lumps in her lap. Her expression did not soften, but a flicker of something understanding, perhaps passed through her eyes. She gave a curt nod and spoke a single word to two younger women who had come to stand beside her. They moved forward to help Marie from the horse. Their touch was firm but gentle, and they supported her as Tavo lifted her down. She felt small and terribly out of place. A broken piece of a different world dropped into the middle of this one. They led her into Nadua's teepee. The inside was spacious and clean, the air cool and fragrant with the scent of herbs. Woven mats covered the ground, and beautifully decorated rawhide containers were stacked neatly against the hide walls. Nadua followed them in and knelt, gesturing for Marie to sit. She then proceeded to give a series of quiet commands. The two younger women left and returned with a basin of warm water and a pile of soft cloths. Nadua knelt before Marie and, without asking permission, began to unwrap her bandages. Marie tensed, but Nadua's hands were as skilled and knowing as Dr. Wilson's had been. As the last of the cloth came away, revealing the swollen, bruised flesh, Nadua made a soft sound in her throat, a note of anger and sorrow combined. She examined the damage with an expert's eye, gently probing the crookedly set bones. She then dipped a cloth in the warm water and began to clean the injuries with a methodical care that eased Marie's fear. As Nadua worked, Marie, remembering her time with the town doctor, found her voice. "Boiled water is better," she said, her voice a little shaky. "It helps to keep the sickness out." Nadua paused and looked at her, a new light in her eyes. She considered the words, then gave a sharp nod and spoke to one of the women, who quickly took the basin and left, returning a few minutes later with steaming water that had been cooled just enough not to scald. Nadua then took a small, dark stone bowl that contained a pungent green paste of crushed leaves and herbs. She applied the poultice to Marie's hands, and a cooling, numbing sensation began to seep into her skin, easing the deep ache in her bones for the first time in days. As Nadua prepared to rewrap her hands, Marie spoke again. "Tighter," she said, gesturing with her head. "A firm pressure helps the bones to knit true." Again, Nadua listened, her expression thoughtful. She nodded and began to wrap the fresh bandages with a snug, even pressure that supported the delicate bones without cutting off the flow of blood. In that small, silent exchange, a bridge of mutual respect was built between the two women. It was the blending of two different kinds of knowledge, two different ways of healing. When the task was finished, one of the women brought a garment of exquisitely soft, smoked deerskin. It was a simple dress, adorned with a few lines of delicate beadwork at the collar. Nadua gestured for Marie to stand and helped her remove the grimy, sweat-stained calico dress she had worn since leaving Bent Creek. The soft, supple leather of the new dress felt like a caress against her skin. It was a shedding of an old life, a cleansing. Nadua touched the dress lightly and spoke a few words in her own language, her voice softer now. Tavo, who had entered the teepee, translated quietly. "It belonged to my sister," he said. "She died last winter. My mother gives it to you. It is a great honor." Marie looked at Nadua, her heart too full for words. She could only nod her thanks, her eyes conveying the gratitude she could not speak. This was not charity. It was an adoption, an acceptance into the fold. The days that followed were a slow, quiet journey of healing. Marie's life fell into the gentle, rhythmic patterns of the camp. In the mornings, she would sit with the women, learning to grind corn on a flat stone, a task made clumsy and difficult by her injuries. A young, smiling woman named Kay, her own belly swollen with her first child, would often sit with her, patiently guiding her awkward movements and teaching her the words for corn, for stone, for baby. A friendship grew between them, a bond woven from shared smiles and the universal language of impending motherhood. Marie learned to be useful in other ways. She would watch the small children while their mothers worked, telling them stories from her own childhood, her strange words and tales holding them rapt. She learned to listen, to distinguish the different bird calls, to recognize the scent of rain on the wind. She began to work her hands, squeezing a ball of soft clay for hours at a time, forcing her stiff, healing fingers to bend and flex. The pain was a constant, grinding presence, but with each small, new movement, she felt a flicker of triumph. But the camp was not a complete escape from the world outside. One evening, Tavo brought her to the central fire, where the elders of the band were gathered. They were old men, their faces like wrinkled leather, their eyes holding the long, sad memory of their people. Tavo spoke to them for a long time, telling the story of Bent Creek. Marie sat beside him, the evidence of his story resting in her lap. When he was finished, one of the elders, a man named Stone Condone, spoke, his voice like the grumbling of rocks. "We have seen the kindness of the white man before," he said, his words translated by another man who knew some English. "It is the blanket they offer before they take your land. It is the food they give you before they herd you onto a reservation like cattle. Their kindness always comes with a footnote written in our blood." The words were a cold dose of reality, a reminder that this peaceful valley was a fragile sanctuary in a world that wished to see it disappear. Tavo stood. "This woman," he said, his voice ringing with conviction, "is not that kind. She stood for us when her own people turned their backs. Her broken hands are the proof. She is not a threat to us. She is a reminder that courage is not owned by any one people." A few weeks later, the camp came alive with a different energy. It was the time of the fall weddings. A great fire was built, and as the sun set, the steady, rhythmic pulse of a large drum began to beat, a heartbeat for the entire community. The people gathered, their faces painted, their finest clothes adorned with feathers and beads. Dancers moved around the fire, their feet stomping the earth in ancient, celebratory patterns. Marie watched from the edge of the circle, feeling a part of it, yet separate. She was healing. She was learning, but she was still an outsider. Tavo, who had been dancing with the other men, broke from the circle and came to her. He did not speak. He simply held out his hand to her. She hesitated, looking down at her own bandaged hands, conscious of her plain dress, her clumsy, foreign ways. But his eyes were insistent, gentle. She took his hand, and he led her into the circle of dancers. He showed her the simple, shuffling step, a rhythmic movement in time with the drum. She was awkward at first, but soon she fell into the rhythm, her feet moving with the others. One with the circle, one with the fire, one with the heart of the people. The music and the motion were a powerful medicine, a joyous, life-affirming force that seeped into her bones. Later, when the dancing had quieted and the fire had burned down to glowing embers, they walked to the edge of the camp, near the gurgling stream. The moon was a silver sliver in a sky littered with stars. He stopped and turned to her. "My heart walks with you now, Marie Coulter," he said, his voice a low, certain murmur in the quiet of the night. It was not a question, but a statement of fact, as simple and profound as the stars above them. She had no grand words to offer in return. She simply reached out with her healing hand and gently touched his arm. In the moonlight, he could see the smile that was her answer. The sanctuary was no longer just a place. It was a person, and for the first time in a very long time, Marie felt that she had truly come home. The peace of the valley was a fragile, precious thing, and it was shattered by the drumming of a single horse's hooves. A scout, riding low and fast, galloped into the center of the camp, his horse lathered in sweat, its sides heaving. He threw himself from the saddle before the animal had even come to a full stop and ran to Nadua's teepee. His words, sharp and urgent, cut through the quiet afternoon air. "Cavalry, 2 days out, riding hard from Fort Concho." A cold dread spread through the camp, extinguishing the warm, domestic glow of the cook fires. There was no panic, no screaming. There was instead a deep, collective sigh of sorrow and a swift, practiced efficiency born of generations of flight. The women began to dismantle their homes, the painted teepees coming down with a sad, rustling whisper. Possessions were bundled, children were gathered. The familiar, heartbreaking rhythm of exodus taking hold. This sanctuary, this brief moment of peace, was already a memory. That night, under a sky that seemed indifferent to their plight, the elders met with Tavo and the other warriors. The plan was to split the main group with Nadua. The children and the elders would flee north, moving through broken country where the soldiers' wagons could not follow. But they needed time. They needed a diversion. "We will lead them west," one of the warriors said, "toward the limestone canyons. We can lose them there." "It will take a dozen riders," Tavo said, his face grim in the firelight. "A decoy party to draw the main force." His eyes scanned the faces of the men who would ride with him. Then his gaze fell on Marie, who stood at the edge of the firelight. Listening, he had wanted her to go north with his mother, to be safe. But he saw the look on her face, the same stubborn resolve she had worn in the saloon in Bent Creek. She stepped forward into the circle of light. "I am going with you." A murmur went through the warriors. Tavo's expression hardened. "No, it is not a journey for you. The riding will be hard, and the danger—" "I can ride," she said, her voice steady. "You have taught me, but that is not why I must go." She held up her hands in the firelight. The bandages were gone now, revealing the crooked, scarred flesh beneath. Her fingers were still stiff, the joints unnaturally swollen. A permanent reminder of Merrick's lesson. "They will not be looking for a white woman," she said, meeting Tavo's gaze without flinching. "If we are seen, they will see you, your warriors. They will see me last, and if we are caught, they will not shoot a white woman on sight. You, they will. I am not a fighter, Tavo, but in this one thing, I can be your shield." Silence fell around the fire. The old elder, Stone Calf, who had been so suspicious of her, looked at her hands and then at her face. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "The spirits work in strange ways. The girl speaks a hard truth. She rides." The ride was a grueling ordeal that pushed Marie to the limits of her endurance and beyond. For 2 days, they rode hard, their small group of 12 a fleeting shadow against the vast, unforgiving landscape. They crossed sun-baked plains and navigated treacherous paths through dense thickets of thorny mesquite. The dust was a constant presence, coating their skin, filling their lungs, turning the world a hazy, reddish-brown. Tavo rode beside her, his face a stoic mask, but his eyes were constantly on her, a silent question, a silent encouragement. She met his gaze each time, her jaw set, refusing to be the weakness that would doom them. She was no longer the saloon girl from the East. She was a woman riding for her life and for the lives of the people who had taken her in. On the morning of the 3rd day, as the first pale light of dawn began to bleed across the eastern horizon, they found themselves in a narrow, high-walled canyon. They had ridden through most of the night, and their horses were near exhaustion. This was the place they had been seeking, a place to rest, to hide, to let the cavalry pass them by. But as the light grew stronger, a glint of metal flashed from the top of the canyon rim ahead of them. A rifle barrel. Tavo raised his hand, and the riders came to an instant halt. A moment later, a similar glint appeared behind them. At the canyon entrance they had just passed through, they were trapped. Blue-coated soldiers materialized from behind the rocks at both ends of the canyon, their rifles leveled, their lines closing like the jaws of a steel trap. They were outnumbered 3 to 1. The warriors dismounted, their movements fluid, accepting the grim reality without a wasted motion. They took cover behind rocks, their own rifles ready. They would not surrender. They would sell their lives dearly on this barren ground. Tavo pulled Marie from her horse and pushed her down behind a large boulder. "Stay here. Do not move." His voice was a harsh command, his face a mask of cold fury and despair. Marie watched as he took his position, checking the load in his rifle. She saw the other warriors doing the same. She saw the calm, fatalistic acceptance in their eyes. They were preparing to die, and in that moment, all the arguments, all the logic that had led her here, solidified into a single, terrifying certainty. If she did nothing, Tavo would die here. They would all die here. Before he could stop her, before she could lose her nerve, she stood up. Tavo grabbed for her arm, his eyes wide with alarm. "Get down." "No," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. She pulled her arm from his grasp. "Let me try." She walked out from behind the boulder, into the open space in the middle of the canyon floor. She held her scarred, empty hands out to her sides, showing that she was unarmed. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, the cold, impersonal stares of the soldiers, the disbelieving stares of the warriors behind her. She was a single, small figure in a calico dress, a ridiculously fragile piece of kindling in the middle of a waiting bonfire. A man in an officer's uniform detached himself from the line of soldiers at the far end of the canyon and walked toward her. He was a captain, his face weathered and weary, the lines around his eyes speaking more of long, hard miles than of cruelty. He stopped 20 paces from her, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "What is this?" he said, his voice rough with disbelief. "What is a white woman doing with this band?" "My name is Marie Coulter," she said, her voice echoing slightly against the canyon walls. She was surprised at how steady it sounded. "These are not a war party. Captain, they are a family. They are my family. They gave me shelter when my own people tried to kill me." The captain's expression was skeptical. "They are Comanche. Miss, my orders are to bring them in." "Bring them in for what?" she asked, her voice gaining strength. "To be put on a reservation to starve while the agent sells their rations. Is that the law you are here to enforce?" She took a step forward, and another. She stopped and held up her hands for him to see, the crooked fingers and ridged scars stark in the morning light. "Look, Captain, this is what the law looks like in Bent Creek. This is what was done to me because I gave one of these people a bowl of stew. This is the civilization you are asking us to surrender to." The captain stared at her hands, and for the first time a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He was a man of orders, a part of a machine, but he was also a man with eyes. He could see the truth of her words written on her flesh. She pressed her advantage. "We are not murderers. We are not thieves. We are just people trying to survive. If you open fire, many of you will die. All of them will die," she said, her voice dropping, a desperate plea now breaking through her composure. And for what? For another patch of dirt, for another line in a report. Captain Morrison looked from her to the silent, waiting warriors, then back to his own men. He was caught between his duty and his conscience. He had seen enough senseless killing in his years on the frontier. "What do you propose?" he said, his voice quiet. "A surrender," she said, "but a surrender with honor. Guarantee their safety. Guarantee that you will escort this group to the reservation, and no other. The main band, the women and children, they have gone north. You must give your word that you will not pursue them." It was an audacious gamble, a treaty being negotiated on a battlefield by an unarmed woman. Captain Morrison was silent for a long, agonizing moment. He looked at her, at the raw courage in her eyes, at the undeniable proof of her suffering. He finally gave a slow, tired nod. "I will guarantee their safety to the reservation agency, and I will report that the rest of the band could not be found." He sighed, a sound of profound weariness. "It is the best I can do." Marie turned and walked back to the rocks. Tavo met her, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. "They will trick us," he said, his voice a low growl. "No," she said, looking him in the eye. "I do not think he will." She touched his arm. "Tavo, we have to live. We cannot win this fight, not with guns. But we can live to fight in other ways. Please, this is the only way." He looked at her, at the fierce hope in her eyes. He looked at his warriors, poised to die for a piece of ground that would be stained with their blood and then forgotten. He saw the long, hard road ahead, the struggle on the reservation, the endless fight with words and laws instead of arrows and bullets. It was a harder, less glorious path, but it was a path that led to tomorrow. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. He turned to his men and spoke a single word in their language. Then he stood up, raised his rifle over his head, and laid it on the ground, one by one. The other warriors did the same. The soldiers did not cheer. There was no sense of victory in the air. As Marie and Tavo and the others rode out of the canyon, escorted by the blue-coated cavalry, a quiet, somber understanding hung in the air. This was not a triumph or a defeat. It was a compromise, a painful, necessary choice made in the cold light of dawn. It was the end of a battle, and the beginning of a much, much longer war. The reservation was a place of fences and dust. The fences were literal. 3 strands of taut wire that separated the tribe's allotted parcel of dry, unforgiving land from the vast prairie they had once called home. The dust was metaphorical, a fine, gritty powder of despair that settled on everything, dulling the vibrant colors of the women's beadwork and coating the tongues of the men who now had no buffalo to hunt. It was a place designed to break the spirit, a slow, grinding siege of government rations, sacks of white flour, tubs of lard, stringy beef, and enforced idleness. And yet, the spirit of the people was not broken. It had simply learned to survive in a different way. Community, once as wide and open as the plains, now drew inward, becoming a tight, fiercely protective circle around the cook fires and within the walls of the crude wooden shacks the government had provided. Laughter was still heard, the high, clear sound of children playing games with stones and sticks. Stories were still told, the old words whispered in the firelight to keep the memory of the world outside the wire alive. Survival here was not a passive act of waiting. It was an active, daily form of resistance. 6 months had passed since they had ridden out of the canyon. 6 months that had been a lifetime. The hide teepee that had been Nadua's home was gone, replaced by a small, drafty wooden shack. A box meant to contain a spirit that had never known walls. Marie and Tavo had a similar shack next to it, small and spare, but a space that was their own. Marie's hands had healed. She would often look at them in the quiet moments of the evening, turning them over in the soft light from their small fire. They were not the hands she had been born with. The bones had knitted together, but with a slight, permanent curve to the fingers of her right hand and a ridge of scarred tissue across her left knuckle. They were a living testament to the price of kindness, a map of her journey. But they were hers again. They could work, they could feel, they could heal. She had become Nadua's apprentice, the older woman, who had at first been so wary, had recognized in Marie a kindred spirit. Marie brought with her the knowledge of the white man's medicine, the fierce belief in boiled water and clean bandages, the understanding of how to splint a bone so it would set straight. Nadua, in turn, opened up to her the vast, ancient pharmacy of the plains. She taught Marie which roots, when chewed, could numb the pain of a toothache, which leaves, when crushed into a poultice, could draw the fire from a burn, and which flowers, when steeped into a tea, could calm a fever. They were a formidable team, their 2 worlds of knowledge blending into a powerful new form of healing. The culmination of her new life, the moment she truly became one with the people, came on a cold night in late fall. Kay, her young friend, had gone into labor with her first child. The birth was a difficult one, the baby stubbornly refusing to turn. The midwife was old and tired, her hands shaking. Fear, a cold and unwelcome guest, began to creep into the small, crowded shack. Nadua looked at Marie, her dark eyes holding a question. Marie's heart pounded. She was not a doctor, only a girl who had watched and learned. But she saw the terror in Kay's eyes, and she knew she had to try. She washed her hands meticulously in boiled water, the familiar ritual calming her nerves. She remembered the words of the old doctor from her parish. the gentle but firm way he had explained the process. She spoke to Kay in a low, soothing voice, a mixture of the few Comanche words she knew and the universal language of reassurance, with Nadua's help. She guided Kay's breathing, her crooked fingers surprisingly gentle and sure as she felt for the baby's position. It was a long, exhausting struggle, a battle fought in the flickering firelight between life and death. And then, just before dawn, a new sound filled the small shack, the thin, furious cry of a healthy baby girl. A wave of relief so profound it was dizzying washed over Marie. She cleaned the baby and wrapped her in a soft rabbit fur blanket, her hands moving with an instinct she did not know she possessed. She placed the tiny, squirming bundle into Kay's waiting arms. Kay looked down at her daughter, her face luminous with exhaustion and joy. Then she looked at Marie, her eyes filled with a gratitude that went beyond words. "Mara," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We will call her Mara." It was the closest her tongue could come to Marie's own name, and in that moment, Marie was no longer an outsider. She was a godmother, a healer, a part of the circle of life in this place of slow death. She had delivered hope into a world of despair. Tavo had been waiting outside during the long ordeal. When Marie finally emerged, weary but triumphant, he was there. He did not speak, but the look in his eyes held all the pride and love in the world. That night, as they sat in their own small shack, a comfortable silence settled between them. Tavo had been changing in these 6 months. The hard, sharp edges of the warrior were still there, but they were tempered by a new, thoughtful patience. He had started to learn English letters from Marie, his large, strong hands looking out of place as they carefully formed the strange, angular shapes. "The fight is not over," he said quietly, staring into the small fire they had built in a makeshift stone hearth. "It has just changed. We cannot fight their guns with our arrows anymore. We must learn to fight their laws with their own words." He looked at her, his expression serious. "Men like Captain Morrison, they are not all bad. They are just caught in a machine. If we can learn to speak to them, to the ones with a conscience, maybe we can build a bridge, a path between our world and theirs, a middle path." It was a dream, a fragile, almost impossible one, but it was a dream of a future that was not about vengeance or escape, but about building something new from the ruins of the old. The shack was cold, and Marie shivered. Tavo moved closer and draped a heavy buffalo robe over their shoulders. She leaned against him, the weariness of the long night settling deep into her bones. He took her right hand, the one with the crooked fingers, and held it gently between his own. He did not say anything about the scars, about the past. He simply held it, warming it, accepting it. He turned her hand over and pressed a soft kiss into the palm. "My spirit is calm when you are here," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "You are my home, Marie Coulter." It was not a grand declaration, not a passionate speech. It was something quieter, deeper, and far more real. It was a simple truth spoken in the darkness, a statement of fact in a world of lies and broken promises. Love, she realized, was not a slogan. It was this. It was the daily act of care, the shared warmth of a single robe, the quiet strength found in another's presence. It was two people choosing, every single day, to survive together, and in that choice, to resist everything that was trying to tear them apart. The winter was long and hard, a season of biting winds that whistled through the chinks in the thin wooden walls of the shacks and of a deep, soul-numbing cold that the small fires could never quite chase away. But winter, like all hard things, eventually passed. It gave way to a spring that brought with it not just the greening of the sparse prairie grass within the fences, but a new, tenacious kind of hope. Marie sat at a small, crude table Tavo had built for her, a single candle pushing back the evening shadows in their shack. In her hand, she held a simple steel nib pen. The act of holding it had, at first, been an exercise in frustration and pain. Her crooked fingers did not want to obey, the muscles weak and the joints stiff, but she had persevered, driven by a quiet, burning purpose. Now, her grip was sure, the pen an extension of her will. Her hands, the hands that had once served whiskey and kneaded dough, the hands that had been broken as a lesson in obedience, had found a new and more powerful purpose. They were learning to fight. She was writing a letter. The paper was cheap, the ink watery, but the words she carefully formed were a potent weapon. This letter was addressed to a pastor in a town 50 miles to the east, a man she had heard spoken of as a person of conscience. She wrote not with anger, but with a cool, devastating clarity. She described the government rations, the flour often infested with weevils, the beef more bone and gristle than meat. She wrote of the water from the creek, how it sickened the children in the heat of the summer, and of the lack of medicine to treat the fevers that swept through the camp each winter. She did not write as a victim pleading for charity. She wrote as a witness, her words a calm, factual indictment of a system that was built on neglect and cruelty. She wrote of the people, of their dignity and their resilience, and of the simple, basic human right they had to clean water and decent food. She signed it not just with her name, but with the title Nadua had given her, Marie Coulter, Healer's Apprentice. When she was finished, she would write another, this one to a newly elected state congressman whose campaign posters had promised a new era of fairness and justice. She knew the letters were a long shot, small paper arrows fired into a storm of indifference, but they were a beginning. Each word she wrote was an act of defiance, a refusal to accept that the fences around them were the end of the world. While Marie fought her battles with ink and paper, Tavo fought his on the dusty ground behind their shack. He had gathered the older children, the boys and girls whose eyes were beginning to hold the same dull look of hopelessness he saw in their parents. He was determined to erase that look. He had become a teacher. He taught them the old ways, showing them how to fletch an arrow so it would fly true, how to read the tracks of a rabbit in the dirt, how to listen to the language of the wind. These were not just skills. They were a connection to the world they had lost, a reminder of who they were, a people of the plains, not prisoners of the government. But he also taught them the new ways. He would take a stick and draw the strange, angular letters of the English alphabet in the dirt, the same letters Marie was teaching him at night by the fire. He taught them the words, their sounds clumsy on his tongue at first, but growing stronger with each lesson. This is their weapon, he would tell the children, his voice low and serious. Their words are the bars of this cage. If we learn their words, we can learn how to unlock the gate. In the evenings, after their separate labors were done, he would tell them the old stories, the tales of the coyote and the eagle, the stories of the creation of their people. He was not just teaching them to read and write, he was giving them a culture that could not be contained by fences, a history that could not be erased by government agents. He was giving them a reason to survive. One afternoon, a lone rider approached the reservation, a sight that always caused a stir of anxiety. But this rider was not a soldier or a government agent. It was a mail carrier, a young man on a weary horse who made the long, lonely circuit through this part of the territory once a month. He had a letter for Marie Coulter. Her heart pounded as she took the worn envelope. The handwriting was familiar, the careful, blocky script of Ben Tucker. She opened it with trembling fingers, her hands that now wrote letters feeling strangely clumsy at the task of opening one. She read it aloud to Tavo and Nadua as they sat outside their shack in the fading light of the afternoon. Ben wrote that Bent Creek was a changed town. Clayton Merrick had been brought to trial. The weight of the town's testimony, the stories of his years of bullying and intimidation, had been overwhelming. He had been convicted, his empire of fear crumbling, his ranch now in the hands of receivers. But, Ben cautioned, the power of a man like Merrick did not die easily. He had friends in high places, and whispers of an appeal, of a quiet release, were already circulating. The old snake was not dead, just coiled in a different basket. He wrote that Sheriff Bradley, to the surprise of everyone, had found his spine. He had stood up to the bounty hunters and opportunistic thugs who had come sniffing around in the wake of Merrick's fall. He had established a fragile but real rule of law in the town. He sent his regards, Ben wrote, and a message that the people of the reservation would not be bothered from his direction. A tentative, unlikely alliance had been forged in the crucible of that high-noon confrontation. Marie finished reading, and a deep silence fell over the three of them. The news was a strange mixture of hope and foreboding. A measure of justice had been done. But the threat was not gone. The world outside the fence was still a dangerous, unpredictable place. Nadua stood, her face impassive. "The white man's justice is like the wind," she said. "It blows in one direction today, and another tomorrow. Our strength is not in their courts. It is here, in us." She touched a hand to her heart and then walked back toward her own shack, leaving them to their thoughts. That evening, Marie could not rest. The news from Bent Creek had stirred something in her, a restlessness that the small, confining space of the shack could not contain. She walked to the edge of the reservation, to the place where the 3 strands of wire marked the end of their world. She stopped and placed her hands on the rough wooden post that held the fence taut. She felt the splintered wood beneath her palms, the unyielding reality of their prison. But as she looked out, her gaze traveled beyond the wire, across the vast, darkening prairie to the distant horizon where the last vestiges of sunlight painted the sky in shades of deep, bruised purple and a fierce, defiant orange. Tavo came to stand beside her, his presence a quiet, solid comfort. He did not speak, but followed her gaze out into the immense, open space, the land they could see but not touch. "It is not a wall," Marie said, her voice barely a whisper. "It is a line, and lines can be moved." He took her hand, the one with the crooked fingers, and laced his own through it. Her scars were a familiar landscape to him now, a part of who she was. He looked at her, at the stubborn set of her jaw, at the unwavering hope that shone in her eyes. It was the same look she had worn in the saloon, in the canyon, the look that had changed his world. They stood there for a long time, 2 small figures silhouetted against the dying light, their hands resting on the fence that was meant to be an ending but which they were determined to make a beginning. The prairie before them was full of shadows and uncertainty, of men like Merrick and men like Bradley, of cruelty and of kindness. It was a long, hard road ahead. But as Marie looked out at the endless expanse, her scarred hand gripping the fence post, she did not feel fear. She felt the first, faint stirrings of a new day, and the unshakable certainty that the fight had just begun. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from in the world so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.